Okay. I believe we're live. Not yet, maybe.
It says live on my screen.
Oh, great. I think... Okay. Great. So we're live. Welcome everyone to the third interview of 2 weeks of databases. So today we're going to have an interview with a great member, long-time member of MySQL community who currently works for PlanetScale, Morgan Tocker. So Morgan can probably introduce himself. So hi, Morgan.
Hi, Federico. How you doing?
Very good. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us
Sure.
about your background and everything?
Yeah, so my background with MySQL started in 2006.
Oh.
I was working as a PHP developer and I needed a job. And someone who worked for MySQL introduced me to work on the support team. So I was very happy to join. From there, I worked on training. I worked on some consulting. And, here I am, I guess 15 years later, working on a little bit of development and documentation and evangelism for Vitess and PlanetScale. But I've worked on various projects, including Bacona and TidyB as well.
Great. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that you started with PHP because I think it was very common at the time, and today is probably much less common.
Yeah, I don't actively write in it anymore. I didn't actively really develop for probably about 10 years, but now I would say my main language would be Go.
Okay. And previously you also worked for TidyB, right?
That's right.
Yeah, great.
Right. So I worked on product management or community evangelism for the last 5 years has been my main focus.
Okay, so no technical roles for a while, right?
I think the goal behind a product manager is to drive the product forward. So
okay.
Sometimes you can do that without being technical. There's always elements to it that people can solve it in different ways. Mm-hmm. But on emerging projects, I think it does help to have a little bit of technical chops, and sometimes it is easier to fix a problem or show how it can be fixed to a team rather than a long explanation to try and reproduce it.
Oh yeah. So probably not officially technical, but
not officially technical. Yeah, somewhere in that gray area.
But it's interesting. So let's talk about your current job. So let's talk about Vitess. First of all, do I pronounce it correctly? Vitess?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, great. And so first of all, I want to say congrats because I see that Vitess gained the graduate state for Cloud Computing Foundation.
Yes, thank you. We're very proud of that.
So do you want to talk a bit about what Vitess is and its history, maybe?
Sure. I think both of those are interesting stories. So I'll start with the history. Actually, I think that's an interesting way to describe it. So, wind back the clock to about 2010, 2011. YouTube was experiencing just massive exponential growth. Mm-hmm. And MySQL was their database, and a single server wasn't going to cut it, right? They did have to scale, and at the time, scaling meant sharding. And I think the way that they chose to solve it was in a very, very generic way. So a way to build a set of building blocks from which you could scale MySQL that anyone could really use, and that was Vitess. Actually, it wasn't called Vitess at the time; it was called Voltron.
Oh, yeah.
It come from the origins of, when you combine these components, then you can kind of save the world. and it's all powerful. But as it kind of stabilized, it became a public project, and obviously Voltron were the trademark. They had to pick another name, and Vitess was a good fit with the VT in it. And it's basically a borrowing of the French word for fast. And so that kind of matches a lot of Vitess's goals. So now you can think of Vitess as it's a proxy for MySQL, but it's not really just one technology with that sort of Voltron origin. It also orchestrates MySQL and helps you scale it. So it can manage things like your backups and manage your replication. And also the proxy has some opinions where it can do things like remove toxic queries that hurt performance. Consolidate queries if you have many, repetitive queries on, the front page of your app. It'll only send one to the backend database rather than sending them all.
Okay.
So I hope that describes it. It's not a single category, which is where the history kind of helps to step in, but it's a scaling system for MySQL. Which I guess the second element to that is, coming out of YouTube and coming out of Google, same as Kubernetes. Being cloud native is really part of its DNA. And the most popular deployments for Vitess are in Kubernetes.
Okay, great. Actually, you mentioned Kubernetes, and I see that the website stresses the Kubernetes part, right? So is it meant to be used together nowadays, or is it something that some big users also use separately?
Yeah, you asked that in a very specific way. Is it meant to be?
Yeah.
I think it's meant to be. I think it's a good harmony. If you ask it a different way, which is it required? It's not actually required either. You could bootstrap these individual components, and the Vitess website does have an example to do a local install.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so do you want to talk a bit about how it works internally? Give us maybe an overview of the internals.
Sure. Do we have the ability to pull up the screen? I'm not sure I've ever tried that.
Sorry?
I was wondering if there's the ability to pull up a screen. Maybe I'll try without, and then maybe we can pull up a picture if we have to. So just from an architecture perspective.
Okay.
Okay. So the proxy that I was referring to, that component is called VT gate. And then that's what receives your queries. That speaks MySQL. It looks like MySQL 5.7 to your applications. And then it routes that query to something underneath called VT tablet, which is normally deployed with a corresponding MySQL D. So Vitess, unlike some other new SQL databases, it does actually use MySQL under the hood. And MySQL has very good performance characteristics in terms of that it has very good tail latencies, and it has very good single server scalability. So with a VT tablet on top and then a VT gate on top of that, you're able to horizontally scale MySQL by adding nodes. There's a couple of other components for management. Vitess uses an external system to store its metadata that it calls the topology service. You can choose to use Zookeeper, etcd, console, or the Kubernetes API to be able to store that metadata. But for the main sort of query serving path, it's VT gate that you speak to, and then it's VT tablet that sort of manages the local copy of MySQL.
Okay, great. A curiosity, how is it, in which languages is it written?
It's written in Go.
Okay, interesting. And okay, we until now only mentioned MySQL, but Vitess can only work with MariaDB, right? Or some versions of it?
Yeah, so let me clarify a detail as well. So
sure.
When you've got a VT tablet server, what I described is it managing the MySQL server. And that could be MySQL, Percona, or MariaDB. You can also run the VT tablet in an unmanaged mode, where it doesn't have to do sort of replication topology changes and things like that. And then you can also support Google Cloud SQL, Aurora, Amazon RDS as well. So really, there's not too many strict requirements other than it has to speak the MySQL protocol. If it is to manage the MySQL server, though, then it needs to be MySQL 5.6 and above, MariaDB 10.0 to 10.3.
Okay. And can you even mix them?
Not completely. So to do things like resharding the tables, it requires GTIDs.
Okay.
And when MySQL and Maria use a different GTID format, it makes that pretty tough to do it.
Yeah.
But you could mix, between Percona and MySQL, for example. That would not be an issue.
Okay, good. Okay, how simple is it to add a node at some point, or maybe remove a node?
Sure. So let's fill in some details. So when you have a sharded, you can have either a sharded or an unsharded key space. Key space is the Vitess term for a database. And we recommend that you try and shard your tables to be about 250 gigabyte shards. It's not a fixed limitation, but that's kind of our goal, because it makes it easier to be able to handle failures. In the YouTube case, they wanted to make sure that they could recover within about 10 minutes if a node fails. And the same kind of goes for resharding operations. If you have this sort of 250 to 1 terabyte size database, it makes it easier to do operations. But the next part of that is to explain that a shard key is divided in a range. So if you think of a 64-bit integer as between 0 and 100, or between A and Z, you can say that to start with, maybe between A and K is one shard, and then between the rest of that is another shard. Then you can start splitting each of these individual ranges. So A and K, you could subdivide further, and you can reshard to add nodes as you need to. This uses the binary log to be able to do that, and it's entirely online. It copies as well from a replica to be able to get the source of the data, and then it applies those binary log changes. So it's fairly low impact to be able to reshard, and all of the operations are handled with Vitess commands to do that.
Okay, this is amazing, actually.
The building blocks were actually there with MySQL in many cases, but they weren't necessarily friendly and easy to use. And Vitess makes it a bit easier.
Okay. Talking about usage, actually, I have two questions about two big questions about usage. One is from developer point of view, and is what should developers know about Vitess to use it, and not just to use it, but also to use it properly, and avoid maybe making some mistakes that could have bad effects?
That's a good question. So I think the way to answer that, I don't see it as so specific to Vitess, but I will answer it that way anyway. So I think particularly with distributed systems, latency is higher. And so I think, some of the mistakes that were, let's say, tolerated with single node instances where you might be retrieving a row at a time with a single query, just repeated, this is going to be much worse in a distributed system. So just small levels of batching, I think, is much healthier for Vitess as it is for other databases that kind of follow the distributed pattern. Vitess inherits, many of MySQL's benefits and flaws. So I would say that Vitess is mainly more suitable for transaction processing style workloads. So the simpler range of queries, but at high throughput, rather than analytics queries. Underneath, it's still MySQL executing queries in a single threaded execution style. Vitess does scatter gather, so it can retrieve from multiple shards at once, which actually might help in some cases, but it's not going to help in every case, right? I think that would be a scenario where if you're looking at it as an analytics database, that might not be the best way to think of it.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Can you tell us something about SQL limitations? I mean, are there queries that should be avoided because maybe don't work as expected?
Yes, so you can have, as I said earlier, unsharded key spaces or sharded key spaces.
Yeah.
And if you have unsharded key spaces to start with, most of the original MySQL syntax is supported because it can just push that down to one individual server. But if you consider the case with a sharded key space, and there's a query where it has some group by aggregation that requires the results to be materialized in an intermediate state to filter further or to kind of roll that up before it sends it to the client, there's going to be some limitations where some of those queries might not execute in Vitess. Because Vitess has to have those intermediate results in memory. It doesn't have like a disk-bound strategy or anything like that yet. Okay.
Can you make some examples of queries that we should avoid with sharded schemas?
Yeah, I mean, they tend to actually relate to my previous answer, which is some of the analytics queries might not be a good fit. As even though it can scatter gather, if it can't retrieve them in order from the underlying servers, if it has to reorder them on the VTgate server, this might consume a lot of memory, and its limit is fairly small to make sure that it doesn't impact other queries that are executing.
Okay, that's good. So, this was about what developers should know.
Right.
What should database administrators or DevOps know about Vitess? Are there maybe some good practices that they should follow, or the opposite, maybe bad practices they should avoid?
Yeah, so I think for a database administrator, not all of us have adjusted to the cloud-like philosophy, which is that you now manage cattle, you don't manage pets. And I think it's more a mindset than a specific skill to know that if a node fails, you probably should throw it away. And Vitess, coming from those cloud origins is still a lot more adept at that. And maybe not all database administrators will feel the same way, but there are very large deployments of Vitess where if a master fails, they don't even try and fix it. They just throw it away.
Yeah.
And they know that their shard size is, the right size that they can do that, and they can just have a replica take over.
Let me be more specific. For example, in monitoring, as a database administrator that manages some Vitess, what should I monitor in particular? What should I pay my attention to, especially?
Yeah, so I think sometimes database administrators, if they were focusing on the right things, they would still be able to operate the same way. From my perspective, working in the MySQL space, sometimes I worry that database administrators are too worried about things like query cache hit ratios and other metrics on the server that don't actually relate to query performance. I think if you have a query performance perspective and you know that individual queries are slow, as measured by the end-to-end time from an application, which leads to individual experiences is slow, you will adapt very well to a distributed system. But I don't know if looking at single box metrics in the Vitess case is how I view the world. A lot of the single box metrics still apply, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to make you successful in a distributed system. For example, there's latency that could be added by having a load balancer in front of VT-gate, and then there's VT-gate, and then there's VT-tablet. And to help your application out, VT-gate has a connection pool. And sort of if you take a single box view of MySQL and you try to optimize that, you're missing all this other information.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's where I think a good DBA will adjust just well. And I'd say you don't need to focus as much on the single server when you have a scalability option other than scaling the single server. So maybe you don't spend as much energy in sub-optimizing MySQL in a Vitess world.
Okay. So basically mostly focus on the performance of the queries.
I think that would be a good starting point.
Okay, good. Talking about migration to Vitess for new users, let's imagine a scenario. Imagine that I am a user with a very big database. Maybe I have a limited number of big tables and then several other smaller tables, which is probably one of the most common cases. How should I proceed to migrate to Vitess? Do you have some suggestions, some procedure that I should follow?
Yeah, so I think step one is knowing if your queries are supported. And as I said, in the uncharted mode, most of them will be. But it's very easy to test that. You could either grab a query digest, and you can play it through VT Explain and see what errors you get. Or because Vitess is stateless, you could actually have some of your connections, so some of your traffic, continue to go through directly to MySQL, and others go through VT-gate and see what errors propagate in VT-gate. And then over time, you could kind of ramp up that VT-gate traffic and eventually make this system managed by Vitess.
Okay.
So as you remember, when we were describing your MySQL options, VT-tablet can speak to an external unmanaged MySQL. And that's sort of how I would start off to be able to evaluate Vitess.
Okay, great. The next question is actually something you partly answered before, but let me ask anyway, because maybe you could have something more to add. I'm not sure. So when is it the case to use, when one would benefit from using Vitess, and in which cases one should probably avoid it? Just to give an example of what I mean, if someone asks me something like that about Galera, I would say avoid it if you have long transactions, or if you have applications that use the auto-increment key to chronologically sort the rows. You have to fix that before. So do you have similar advices about Vitess?
Yeah, so good use cases, obviously, Vitess is sharding. That's a very obvious problem with MySQL, that it's single server. But there are other benefits. So there's a blog post on Vitess.io which describes the benefits of unsharded Vitess, and it has connection pooling, it has query consolidation, and elimination of toxic queries. So my hope actually is that as Vitess gets easier to use, it's a very natural fit as almost like a database firewall that everyone will want to put it in front of any database that serves production traffic.
Okay.
I don't know if it's there yet. I think the obvious case currently is very much sharding, but I think there's an interesting overlap for all databases, sort of moving down the future. Where to not use it, I would say there's a lot of overlap with where to not use MySQL. And that's, as you said, that I answered it kind of prior. I think it's maybe not your best fit for analytics style use cases where you have ad hoc queries. It does have some redeeming features. So I mentioned that it can scatter gather. Another thing that it can do is it can actually do materialized tables. So it can use the binary log to sort of materialize a version of a table in an eventually consistent way, so that table, almost like a lookup table, exists on all of the shards to help simplify queries and optimize push down conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Great. So sharding is the most obvious use cases, and well, you mentioned others, but do you have maybe some particularly interesting success stories to report about users that maybe implemented Vitess for sharding or for other reasons and had impressive well, you already mentioned YouTube, of course, but
right.
I suppose there are others, right?
Because if I look at a recent one.
Yeah, great.
I'll give you a recent one. So Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, he called out PlanetScale and said, thanks for the help. It's not a secret they use Vitess under the hood. Mm-hmm. They've had a lot of recent growth. They've had to double their scale of their databases, and they've managed to do that online with no issues. So I think that being able to adjust to scale is really a useful feature.
Okay, great. And can you tell us maybe something about the future? So can you share maybe some roadmap?
Yeah, so a few things. Let's go for medium term first. I think medium term, what the goal is for Vitess is to make it work with a lot more of MySQL's query dialect. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot easier to drop in replace. So I said in the unsharded case, it supports most of MySQL's queries. It should really support all of MySQL's queries. Mm-hmm. And so we're aiming to get that level of compatibility. And then improving, obviously, the compatibility on the sharded key space as well, I think will be important to allow users to not lose really many features at all as they move into a sharded table. Ease of use, we're trying to make it easier to install. Obviously Kubernetes solves part of that problem, but just making it more flexible for different deployment styles, I think will improve ease of use. Long term is also interesting. I don't think there's anything that specifically ties Vitess to MySQL. And I think many of the properties could carry over to add things like PostgreSQL support. So that you'll be able to choose which database you'd like to use, and you'll be able to scale either in the same horizontal fashion.
Okay. I suppose in all cases, one cannot mix them, right?
Yeah, well, I'll clarify. We haven't started that part yet, but I would assume that that's going to be hard based on things like GTIDs, and you probably have, this is my MySQL Vitess, and this is my Postgres Vitess. Okay. But there's a lot of components internally that certainly we can reuse in developing that.
Okay. About what you said in the midterm, so about implementing more SQL, do you think that it will become more suitable for analytics also?
I don't know if it'll get much better. Yeah,
Okay.
I think it has redeeming features over MySQL, but I think MySQL will be the limitation there to do ad hoc analytics. Certainly, if you swap out the MySQL engine and you change from InnoDB to something else, then it'll be in a better scenario.
Okay.
And Vitess certainly supports that, as it's fairly storage engine agnostic.
Okay.
But absent from that, Vitess's kind of a query execution strategy does try and push as much down to MySQL for processing as it can, so it'll inherit those limitations.
Okay. Okay, so this is actually something I didn't ask before, but is it possible to use Vitess with MySQL, but with another storage engine?
Yes.
I mean, not necessarily InnoDB or, yeah.
Yeah, so internally, I'd say most of our customers are on InnoDB, but I think there's a small minority using MyRocks.
Okay.
And then some people evaluating MyRocks.
What benefits do they see?
Yeah? I think compression is a large one. I think compression is very important.
Okay. What benefits do they see in using MyRocks?
So particularly if you have a lot of text-based data, having native compression, the compression options supported by InnoDB are not as good as the compression options supported by MyRocks.
Yeah. Okay.
And they'll save space essentially. It just becomes a resources game. They have good enough performance with either of them, but they have a lower footprint with MyRocks.
Okay.
It leads to direct cost savings.
Okay, yeah, which is why MyRocks was created, in my understanding.
Yeah, okay. Might as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I have another question, which is not really related to Vitess, but it's more related to the time we're living, because everyone knows about the current health situation and so on, and most of the world is, I suppose, in lockdown, and companies had to start working remotely. Some of them already did, others began later. You surely have a lot of experience in working remotely. So do you have some advice for companies who maybe had to start just now and maybe they're kind of suffering for this new way of working because they're not used to it? It's not part of their company culture.
Right.
So do you have some advice for them?
I do. And I do think that you have to do it company-wide. So I remember back when I joined MySQL, there was very strong culture around how to work from home. And simple things like if I send you an email and you're in two, I expect you to read it and probably reply. And if you're in CC, it means I just expect you to read it, sort of like a rules of engagement. Because you can't necessarily tell with email being asynchronous that everyone got it the same way as you can kind of tap someone on the shoulder in the office and make sure. I think, having core working hours in MySQL was also really useful, where you had to basically commit to 5 hours. You would guarantee you would be there. And then, you'd make up the rest of your day in some other time. I think that helps a lot. And obviously writing everything down as you make decisions in meetings, I think makes it much more effective than if you don't write that down and people have to find out how decisions were made by some other way.
Yeah, I agree with everything.
Yeah, I'll clarify one thing though. Being a remote worker, it's still hard for us. So, many of us have our own system of working that's also been disrupted. So in my case, I don't usually have 2 kids at home to get in my way while I'm working. So it's different for everyone. I certainly feel for those that are working from home for the first time, but I know from my other remote colleagues, they have challenges too.
Actually, do you also have advice for single workers who maybe are having problems because of children at home, or maybe even without children, sometimes the person who live with us sometimes don't understand that we're actually working,
Right.
and we should kind of be left alone sometimes, right?
I wish I did. Yeah, I mean, I think the way I've adapted and tried to make that work is sometimes after lunch, I can tell my kids are not going to let me work. So if I know I'm not going to be productive, try and shut it down and then restart it maybe 8 or 9 at night and get a few more hours in.
Yeah.
That's how I've adapted. But I wouldn't say it's a 100% a success story yet. I'm still working on that.
Yeah, yeah. I also read a lot of people complaining that they are overworking in the current situation, probably because they find it harder to say, okay, guys, yes, I'm still sitting on my table, but
Right.
I stopped working.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And another thing is that some managers inherently can't tell how much they're loading their workers with specific tasks. They only observe from in the office if someone looks busy or isn't busy. So if they just keep throwing things over the fence and that person is remote, they won't see how underwater they are.
Yeah.
I know that's a problem for some. I think I've certainly learned how to manage that in my own way. So I'm not so vulnerable, but I do certainly feel empathy for those that just can't stop working as a result. That is definitely a risk of not having that office communication.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's almost all. And I say almost because there is one question that I ask everyone. Every person interviewed. And it is, okay, because of the time we're living, we are having a lot of time to read. Okay, so do you have maybe 2 books to suggest to our guests? And actually, if it's possible, one database-related book and also a book on any other topic you like.
Right. Yes, I do. So I'll go for the any other topic first. I thought Bad Blood, the book about Theranos, was a really good read.
Okay.
And I think kind of interesting in a way because they were a healthcare company that promoted themselves as a tech company, and then that had some obviously associated downsides when they overpromised and underdelivered. That might be a nice way of putting it. So I think just from having that tech company perspective, it was really interesting to read that and very well written.
Okay.
I heard they're making a movie about that, which I think would be an interesting watch. On the database side, I'm probably not going to recommend a book, but a paper, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I recently read this paper by Manuel Rigger. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He was the lead author. So you're probably familiar in the MySQL space. We've used random query generation for years to be able to crash the server and use it as part of a quality effort where it just generates a query that's syntactically valid. And it's never been about checking that the results are valid. It's been about trying to crash the server. Actual testing of servers for if they return correct results is not something that's commonly automatically generated. But there's this paper that Emmanuel wrote, which is called PQS, Pivoted Query Synthesis, I think is what it was described, which basically it's like a random query generator. But it generates queries to try and ensure that the predicates or the where clause essentially is always true for a specific row. And then it checks to see if that row exists in the result. And if it doesn't, it knows that there's a bug in the system.
Okay.
So random query generation, deterministic in that it should always have a specific row, and if it doesn't, there's a bug. Why I think this is interesting is that the author found 120 bugs in MySQL, Postgres, and SQLite. And I think that is definitely worth mentioning because it's very hard to find that number of bugs.
Yeah. Do you use it in, or do you plan to use it in Vitess?
I would like to, yes. Okay. I would say it's at the idea stage. I wouldn't say it's at the plan stage. I think it's really interesting. So the technique itself is part of the paper. I don't believe there's any open source implementation for how to do it. So we would have to write our own implementation of PQS to be able to check for correctness.
Okay. Do you use the random query generator even if its current form, so without this advanced checking, but just to see when server
not currently.
Okay.
So I could talk a little bit about our CI system. So every commit to Vitess does do about 2.5 hours of testing in parallel. And we use GitHub Actions to be able to do that. It's a very good system that I'm quite happy with. And we test on MySQL 5.6 to MySQL 8, MariaDB 10.0 to 10.3. Mm-hmm. And as soon as there's updates to new MySQL or MariaDB releases, we'll pull those in and also test to make sure that we have correctness.
Great. Well, actually, a couple of questions ago, I told it was the final question, but you just brought me to an interesting place. So I ask a very final question. Sure. How do you test Vitess?
So a combination of unit tests and end-to-end tests. Mm-hmm. So Vitess, as I said, it handles a fair bit of MySQL scope. So we have to test backups as well to make sure that they're successful. And Vitess has a couple of backup providers, so it can use extra backup and it can use a file backup. And every commit runs the same test suite. It's the easiest way to do it at the moment, at least. And so we run about 2.5 hours of tests on every commit.
Okay. Do you also interact with MySQL and maybe MariaDB to deal with the bugs in the underlying technology that still affect Vitess?
Yes, I would say more so with MySQL than with MariaDB. Is most of our PlanetScale customers are on MySQL. Mm-hmm. Certainly, we've given them some feedback as new MySQL 8 releases have occasionally introduced some breakages. Mm-hmm. I have my feature requests as well. Often it's around more metadata from the server. I think that makes it much easier to be able to offer a system that sits on top of MySQL. So I have a particular feature request if I can kind of advertise it. It would be much easier for Vitess to figure out how to execute DDL if, say, the MySQL server supported like an explain for DDL. And then we can choose which mechanism to use based on if it's going to be a quick alter or a slow alter.
Okay.
It's of that sort of vein that I think is really interesting communication to have.
Great. Okay, so I think this was really the final question. So thank you a lot for your time. I think that we talked about very interesting things, and I enjoyed to dig a bit into how Vitess works.
Thank you for having me. Happy to answer.
Great. Hope to have you again somehow, not during these 2 weeks, but maybe in the future. And I just want to say to our viewers that 2 weeks of databases continue tomorrow with and also next week with more interviews. Check our YouTube list, and you will see the complete list of the interviews in the upcoming days. So thank you again, Morgan. Thank you for everyone who watched, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Federico, for putting this on.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.